Hello, everyone, and welcome to XKDR's Big Ideas. Our guest for today is Dr. Philipp Krause. Dr. Krause is a specialist in public finance and administration with interests in budgeting, fiscal governance, and monitoring and evaluation in particular. He is a visiting fellow at the University of Potsdam and has advised several public agencies on public finance issues. Dr. Krause, welcome to Big Ideas.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
First off, I would actually like to understand this idea of analyzing government in development. How did this come about?
So, firstly, the history is, if you think about it, a lot longer than what you find in contemporary development cooperation. So, if you wanted to be really broad about it, you are probably going to be able to say that governments have been looking at each other and analyzing each other for as long as there's been two governments sort of in contact with one another. The ancient Romans were spending a lot of time writing about government systems of other countries or states in the Mediterranean and so on. But if you wanted to talk about the modern concept of government analysis, that I think goes back to the French Revolution and the legacy of the French Revolution. A lot of it at the time was driven as much by nervousness and worry. So, there was a revolution in France. All of a sudden, the French were sweeping all the old powers of Europe in front of them, were very powerful militarily. And immediately all of the other states on the continent were looking at France and thinking, what's the secret sauce here? What is it that we have to do? We don't want to have a revolution, but we might have to start adopting some of those changes. And at the same time, the French, when they came to Italy and Germany in particular, they then started to institute some of the changes and administrative changes as much as political changes that they had been adopting at home. And there's a very, very famous history of Germany in the 19th century that basically the first sentence of that book is, in the beginning, there was Napoleon, because German history in the 19th century is basically determined by the French Revolution and the impact of the French Revolution. And from that time on, you find a lot of these notions that we are nowadays very familiar with. The idea that there's progress, that there are countries that are more advanced and that there are countries that are less advanced. The idea that there are reforms, the idea that you are not necessarily enthusiastic about reforming, but you might find yourself under pressure to do so anyway. And again, this applies to the political space as much as it does to the administrative institutional space, if you will. And throughout the 19th century, then there are many examples going into the 20th century as well. I think the Meiji reforms in Japan of the, from the 1870s, 1880s, there was a lot of exchange between Japan and Europe, countries in Europe and the United States, where delegations were sent to analyze how does the legal system work, how does the military work, how does the education system work, and so on, to bring those lessons and institutions, try them out in the context of Japan, where some of them were then adopted, changed, recombined into other things. And in the main, of course, that turned out to be quite successful, if by success you mean, the objective for Japan was to become an internationally recognized great power. And by the turn of the 20th century, they had done so. Of course, if you wanted to come a little bit closer to today, then this is all something that became what it is today in the 1990s, from the 1990s onward.
Yeah, so interesting. I think let's expand on that. How does it look today? What are the challenges that we can see today as well? Yeah.
Yes. So today, the system that we have today is, of course, a system that is determined by and framed by international organizations, international practices and norms and so on. And all of that we find taking shape from the 1990s onwards.
Yeah.
So there are two big things that happened in the 1990s that drove this change. Firstly, you have the end of the Cold War and the transition of a lot of economies from basically socialist economies to some kind of market-based economy, from socialist political system to some form of democracy, very broadly defined, which put many international organizations suddenly in a position to try and think about, if you have to reorganize and reshape the way that the economy is working in very short order, how do you do that? How do you think about all of these things?
Yeah.
And that is one thing. The other thing is that, of course, international development in the 90s had already been through multiple major crises. And what is especially pertinent there is that throughout the 1980s, where you had structural adjustment, you had lost decade in Latin America and so on. In the 1980s, development organizations, when they were looking at developing countries, they were looking at them primarily in terms of policies. What are the macro policies, the economic policies, the tax policies, the, you name it, policies that you need to adopt in order for your economy to grow? And slowly the realization dawned on people that you cannot talk about policies in isolation. We have to think about the institutional underpinnings of those policies.
Yeah.
And that then forces us to start thinking systematically about how do we approach this question of what's an institution? Which of those are relevant, and how could we possibly make them change in a way that is actually amenable to practical work and not just curious philosophical inquiry, which is a different story.
Yeah. And institutions and governance, how do you see their role in this at this point?
So you would have to distinguish, I think, between public sector institutions or government and governance. With governance has a tricky role in the development space, because ostensibly development organizations are non-political, and therefore we are couching governance is essentially, to me, the study of political institutions in non-political terms. And that, as theoretically, we know that is important, is probably terribly important. Practically, I think we have never quite worked out what to do with it. And so there's been a bifurcation between the analysis of governance and the analysis of government that now, I think, at this point is quite well established. Where if you look at governance, you have tools like, for instance, the worldwide governance indicators, which is something that has been around for, I think, well over 20 years at this point. That works quite well as a high-level aggregate index that hoovers up lots of noisy data to try and come up with a very, very aggregate measure of accountability, transparency, and so on and so forth. And that that, for what it's worth, that works. However, it's not terribly practical. If you're looking at a country today and you're trying to think of, you're a reformist civil servant or a reformist politician, those indicators are not going to tell you what is it that I need to do between now and, let's say, 2 years from now when my political window of opportunity closes. So that is governance. Government, on the other hand, has stultified a bit over the years because we have come from a place where about 20 years ago, so this is the early 2000s, we have a lot of analytical work that is being done in a sort of slightly free-flowing manner. A lot of donor agencies were going to countries, were writing lots of reports about public sector this, public finance that, budget this, procurement that. And over time, we're becoming quite self-conscious about their ability to actually focus on what's relevant and not overburden partner governments with just piles and piles and piles of reports. And so what they were doing instead was then to get together sort of committee style and say, if we're looking at an area like public finance, which is sort of my area of specialty for the most part, what are the things that really matter? What are the specific tools, institutions, and instruments that really matter? Let's define those and then focus our analytical work on those things. And so now you have these indicator sets that are very well established. For public finance management, for instance, is something called the PIFA, public expenditure, what is it, fiduciary accountability? I actually don't remember what it stands for literally. And so you have a lot of indicators that are looking at things like, what is the internal audit system? What is the external audit system? What is the budget system? What is the accounting system, et cetera, et cetera. And then define in a lot of detail how you can track in a very, by necessity, in an internationally compatible way, how to do that analysis.
Thanks. It really cleared up the difference between the government and governance, because that's quite confusing sometimes for most.
It can be, no, for sure.
Yeah. I just wanted to understand what are some of the challenges you've faced in this approach, and yeah.
Right. So in terms of the challenges, a lot has been written about this because we are now looking at maybe 20 years of experience from the mid-2000s to now. We're getting there to the mid-2020s. And from about 10 years or so onwards, there was a dawning realization that, okay, so we've made a sort of good faith effort to try and understand what are the things that we want to focus on, what are the things that we want to measure, how do we measure them? Fine. You get together with a group of experts, you settle on a consensus what those are, and then you go, and that's basically the focus of your conversations. That's the focus of the analysis that you undertake. Conversations with the government, I mean. Now, the problem is that the way that you structure these indices and these composites is necessarily defined by the experience of countries that were rich in the early 2000s, because this was intellectually very interesting, but also very challenging. How do you decide which institutions are important? And so the underlying logic there was that we don't know exactly why an external audit institution might be related to development and growth, but all the rich countries have one. So it's probably a good idea for developing countries to also get one. And you then replicate that in very minute detail into all the specialist spheres and of public sector governance and public sector institutions. And that is, of course, tricky, because if you ask experts, domain experts in these sub areas, then they're always going to say, of course, our area is really important. It needs to be in the index. Let's find a way to define what's good, what's okay, and what's best. Ultimately, the logic is sort of, if you want to be as rich as Denmark, to coin a phrase, institutionally speaking, you sort of have to become Denmark. And irrespective of where you are in your development journey, whether you're a small country or a big country, whether you're Nigeria or you're India or you're Brazil, you know that is the destination that you want to go for. And that limits how creative you can become and how sensitive to context you can become when you're trying to set priorities for reforms and for institutional change. And the literature that we have seen in the last decade or so has been quite focused on those sorts of issues. That is the way that best practices are becoming dominant in the reform conversations rather than best fit. Matt Andrews at Harvard University has been doing a lot of work on those sorts of things, that you might superficially do these reforms without really adopting them into practice. The term from organizational sociology is isomorphic mimicry, and so on and so forth. What I would like to emphasize is actually something slightly different, which is that almost as a somewhat intended side effect of all of this, we now live in a world of analytical monocropping, where you don't have this jungle of many, many different reports and analytical products, which admittedly, many of them used to be of somewhat dubious quality. Now we've all decided that if there's a public sector question, there probably is a standard approach and a standard tool. And that is the thing that is going to be applied. And so if the issues that the country faces, let's assume that those issues are sort of out there and they exist independently of our analytical lens, then if these analytical tools capture it, great. If they don't capture it, then too bad, because you are going to find it increasingly harder over the years to commission research, to do work that lies outside of the scope of these standardized tools. And to my mind, in recent years, that has become a really, really serious problem, because if you wanted to find a way that you can tailor what it is that you want to try and understand in a country, then that has become much harder than it used to be.
Yeah, I recall a conversation I had actually a few weeks ago with someone where they talked about isomorphic mimicry when it came to state capability.
Yes.
And that you can't, developing countries can't follow the way of the US or Denmark in terms of its growth, because it used to grow at 2% for decades compared to the growth differences here. So I think just adding to that, then what is the way forward if we need to then develop a sustainable sort of way of analyzing government and development?
Yep. So that's actually a really, really interesting way of framing the issue, because I think isomorphic mimicry in and of itself isn't always bad. If you are looking at your institutional problems and your development problems in a domestic context right now, it would be foolish for you not to broaden your horizon and look at what else is out there. What is it that others have done? If of the many obvious mistakes you can avoid a few of them by understanding how the story went in other countries. Why deprive yourself of that knowledge? As long as it doesn't tip over into something that then becomes quite rigid and forces you to only consider things that are sort of on that Denmark path. And, there were periods of time for most countries in what is today the OECD that had very, very rapid growth spurts. However, unfortunately, we don't exactly understand, I think even to this day, what exactly was it that brought them about, and why is it that they came to an unfortunate end at a time that was never quite predicted by people who were operating in that space. But that's a different story. So we can get to that to some other time, and there are other people who understand that far better than I do. On the institutional side, and that question of how do you understand government, I think the big change and the big opportunity that we've seen in the last couple of years is that through the advance of digital technology, we're now finding us in a space where you have many, many countries that increasingly have a large share, at some point, basically all of their administrative data in digital format. And that's a huge change because if you go back 20, 30 years ago, some of it would have been digital and sort of locked away in proprietary systems, very difficult, not networked systems, where that's easier to get to than paper, but still pretty difficult. And mind you, a lot of other administrative data, of course, still paper-based. Yeah. And our mindset, I think, as analysts is still sort of assuming that, okay, yes, they are digital data sets, but they're difficult to access, and that doesn't necessarily make my analytical work a whole lot easier. And our approach to analyzing government is still assuming that whatever we do is kind of sort of a one-off exercise, right? Whereby we go and we liberate data sets from these different systems. We put together a data set. If we're lucky, then it's not just a cross-section. We get a couple of years of data. Then we ask it some interesting questions. We write that up. We present it to policymakers or decision makers, and then we move on. And hopefully something happens. Whereas increasingly now, you are going to be able to access administrative data if you are working in government, if you are a civil servant somewhere, in maybe not quite real time, but on a continual basis. And with the way that data are moving into the cloud and are moving out of those data silos where they have lived for a very long time, the accessing is becoming easier and easier. It's easier to automate a lot of that work and so on, which means that theoretically you can go and start asking questions of administrative data that you can access in relatively short order of time. Why is that important? It's important because you then don't have to rely on one-off, often externally commissioned pieces of analysis anymore. And you don't have to rely on the hope that this is ultimately sort of a leap of faith that you have to take every single time. Like I said, we don't really know why external audit might be important. We don't know why a particular form of an accounting system might be important. We don't actually know whether a medium-term budget is good for fiscal discipline, or it is only good for fiscal discipline if it comes hand in hand with a certain set of fiscal rules, etc., etc. But if you have access to large data sets, then or large sets of administrative data, then suddenly you can start to think about, on the basis of this, what are the outputs, if you want to use that language, and outcomes that you want to start tracking, because decision makers who are outside of that system actually care about them. Let's assume for a second, nobody really cares about procurement guidelines, but a lot of people care about how many tenders might get cancelled, how long does it take on average to do a tendering process, what are the cost differentials spatially between sectors, and so on and so forth. And all of those things you can now start looking at cheaply and relatively quickly, rather than as a sort of a one-off exercise. And there are people who are at the forefront of this. There's something called the Bureaucracy Lab at the World Bank, which is led by someone named Dan Roger, who has done a lot of fantastic work in this space. There are lots of universities that are now picking up on this, because it's very interesting work. All of a sudden, there's much more that you can do with the public sector. And if you look at that, it just changes your perspective of what is analytically possible about public sector institutions and about government in a fairly major way. And my sense is that we are only at the beginning of this process, because this isn't going to change everything overnight, but in time, it will allow us to formulate new theories, new frameworks, and new ideas about which public sector institutions are actually relevant for what and in what way. What's the link to service delivery? What's the link to metrics that show up in citizens' lives? What are some basic benchmarks, measures of effectiveness and efficiency, and so on? And to look into that future, I think, is properly exciting. Now, I wouldn't be an outside analyst if I didn't caveat that with a whole bunch of footnotes. So let me do that. I think this isn't some panacea that is going to turn every government into some digital and efficient sort of super state overnight, or in fact ever, because we know this already, and we know it quite well, that an increase in the supply of information doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions, and it doesn't necessarily change the way that decision makers think about their priorities and what it is that they actually want to get done. However, if you're just looking at this from an analytical lens, the ability to restart our sort of creative engines when it comes to government analysis, to ask better questions and answer them, put more work like that out there in the public space, is going to make a difference over time. And I think that is a very exciting prospect.
The data is the key to understanding these indicators, essentially, to know whether it's good for institutions and government.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
Data isn't everything, but it makes a hell of a lot of stuff a hell of a lot easier if you want to work in that space and get some stuff done. And so, yes, in that sense, definitely true.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Krause. This was a
Thank you very much.
conversation.
Been a pleasure.